We are live. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Eric Siegel, the other Eric Siegel, or maybe the Eric Siegel, and I'm the other Eric.
Yeah, you're Eric Siegel too. I'm Eric Siegel 1.
Awesome. Well, I get that with Jeff too, but that's more of an appearance thing rather than the thing.
For sure.
So today's episode, we're going to talk about AI's concrete business value with Eric Siegel, who is the author of the AI Playbook, a book that I read a few months back, partly because his name is the same as mine, but partly because I've actually seen his other books, Predictive Analytics, for example. He is the founder of ML, Machine Learning Week magazine, and he is the CEO of a new startup. He said it was 1.5 years in running called Gooder AI. And Eric Siegel, what is on your mind?
What's on my mind is metrics. How good is it? Well, how much value will it generate in terms that matter to the organization, which for many is simply profit or savings. And strangely enough, those numbers don't come up when you're evaluating machine learning models most of the time. What you'll find is data scientists give you these technical metrics: precision, recall, F-score, area under the curve. Even accuracy is only a technical metric. And these things tell you how good the model is and potentially better than guessing, which is often all that we can really hope for. It means it's potentially valuable, but tell you nothing about how valuable in terms of profit and savings, which leaves stakeholders in this very uncomfortable position routinely, which is, gee, I don't really get it. How am I supposed to understand the potential value in concrete business terms? How am I supposed to decide whether to authorize the deployment, the launch of this model? And in fact, as a result, most enterprise machine learning projects fail to deploy.
Yeah, well, I also think that there is a great fear added to it, right? It is still somewhat new and they don't know how it fits within the organization, what data it's going to use or potentially steal, and all kinds of other just general business fears. And you are taking it, you are in essence far ahead of the curve in saying, not only should you adopt it, you should measure it and you should know what it's going to do for you.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't stress test a rocket and its intended usage with a wind tunnel and all this kind of stuff, then launching it is a shot in the dark, and a sensible decision maker would scrub the launch. Right. The same thing applies to launching a model. We've got to evaluate it, forecast its potential value in concrete terms, in terms of the effect, the impact it's going to have on operations and the improvement thereof that matters in terms like profit or savings, in terms that are just concrete and simple, straightforward, the lingua franca of business.
So it's really interesting that you bring this up, because one of my past roles was I was responsible for building a data analytics function at Cracker Barrel, the restaurant company. And what you're describing is one of the things that I watched happen, where we had this machine learning model that was intended to predict store traffic, which obviously has a huge impact on, food ordering, food production, labor, etc. And it was really amazing because I was sitting there going, listen, this model is interesting, but we have not stress tested it. We need to put it in a couple of stores. I mean, this is a company, mind you, that if you change the jam, would spend 6 months testing different jams and whatever. But they were like, no, we just need to put this in the model because we need to take the.
When you say jam, you mean the background music at the restaurant?
No, literally like the jelly. I'm like, they wanted to change, like the raspberry jam or something.
Okay, yeah.
It would be like a 6-month project. We'd have to test it, whatever. But we're just gonna and I remember saying to my team, I'm like, what could possibly go wrong? We put a machine learning model that's going to predict traffic to the store, and of course, within about 2 weeks, something went wrong, right? Because it's
So when you say traffic, do you mean it's predicting the amount of foot traffic, like the number of people coming in the store? Yeah. So what you're describing, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? Because I'm going to extrapolate a little bit on the limited amount you told us so far. It sounds pretty similar to sort of your typical predictive endeavor, which is, hey, this seems like a really good idea. It would obviously be valuable for us to predict these types of outcomes or behaviors on a daily basis or weekly or whatever it is. But what's lacking is a concrete plan of how you're going to act on those predictions. So for example, are you going, if it's predicting tomorrow we'll have very low foot traffic, then what are you going to spontaneously blast a bunch of coupons for anyone who comes in tomorrow? Or what is the actual action you're going to take based on the predictions? And then for any such potential deployment, so that's the launch. The deployment is when you actually start acting on the predictions. Then how do we estimate the potential value or potential downside of doing so? So that sort of step from this seems like a great idea to predict it. We've got data scientists. We've got lots of data on it. We do sound number crunching. The last mile is a light year between that and then actually acting on it and getting it deployed.
Well,
so I mean, things that I have noticed over the past couple of years, and maybe a little bit less now, was, the CEO of the company is asking, how are we using AI, ML? How are we using generative AI? Or the VCs are asking, how are you using it? And it was like, if you can't answer that question, you get sort of a ding on their checklist. And obviously that's played into this, lack of metrics. Like, we just have to show that we're doing something.
Well, I'm gonna tell a very dark, scary story. I'm gonna be real cynical here for a second. It's come to pass that in the last decade or two, doing just the number crunching, without necessarily having a clear, viable path to deployment, and indeed generally not deploying, qualifies as, quote, doing it. So you check that box, you sleep well at night, we're using the best rocket science, we've got the best experts on it. We're doing that number crunching, and so we're doing it, but you're not doing it because you're not acting on it. And that's the status quo for most enterprise ML projects.
Yeah, I agree. Well, it's, actually, I'll steal another example from my background where, like, it was very similar to what you were talking about, where I was getting that somebody had, I don't even remember what we were building a model of, but somebody had built a machine learning model, data scientist built a machine learning model, and he kept reporting to me the accuracy of his model. And I'm like, what is it telling me? I don't know. I think, I don't know if you've probably come across this, but this idea of it's not enough to have data maturity and so forth. There's an analytical readiness component that has to happen, meaning there's a human side and there's do we have the technology, do we have the capability, whatever is interesting, but there's a human side, which is, does the organization understand what it is that we're doing, why we're doing it, and how to use it? So love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, and we hear the story anecdotally millions of times over and over, like all we're getting is this kind of technical metric like accuracy. In general, data scientists are not trained the books, the courses, to report on and estimate the potential business value in terms of profit or savings or any other kind of straightforward KPIs, whatever may pertain to the organization. And it's sort of left to the stakeholder to sort of deal. It's kind of like if your doctor uses a bunch of arcane terms and they're not speaking to you in layperson language. But that's ridiculous. The doctor's responsibility is to actually communicate to you as a healthcare patient. And likewise, the data scientist, this has got to change. There's no reason to keep it arcane and to protect themselves in that obscure world of abstraction where it's just like, look, it predicts X times better than guessing, which is good to know. Necessary, but not sufficient by any means. Accuracy in particular, yes, just a technical metric. It's almost always the wrong metric. It's how often are you correct, but typically the thing you're trying to predict happens a minority of the time. If it's more valuable, like a high value customer or a train wheel that's going to break or a transaction turns out to be fraudulent, the things that happen less often are more valuable to predict. So just that sheer overall count that doesn't differentiate between positive and negative, accuracy is wrong. Measures like lift and area under the curve kind of take that into account. They may be more viable, typically are, and yet still they're a far cry from something so mind-blowingly simple. It's right in front of our faces and we're missing it. Profit and savings.
And so mind-boggling, like for instance, all the precious gem gets eaten because the traffic has been predicted as too high and nothing is left there. So
right. Well, so now Elena's actually getting into the weeds, and that's what all stakeholders, not just the data scientists, the stakeholders have to get into those weeds. What is the cost of predicting too much foot traffic when there's too little, or vice versa? What's the actual cost of those mispredictions?
Right.
That's where you can start to cobble together an estimation of the value if you acted on the predictions in a certain way.
Well, I think it's not just a way of talking about it that the data scientists are sometimes missing. Like, I was working with data science in the drug discovery space, and we're talking about how the receiver operator characteristic is close to closer to 1 or whatever. But like, when you're doing drug discovery, it's not like you're trying to figure out the efficacy of a diagnostic test where the false positives and false negatives matter across the entire population. You are only going to be able to afford this tiny, tiny sliver at the very, very, very top end of your prediction curve. And what matters is, what you're calling lift, the lift, but only in that extremely tiny segment. And I think there's a tendency to not only miscommunicate, but misunderstand the business problem, as you said, because of the metrics, not just as a presentation task.
Yeah, I would like to, as a data scientist, I'm now going to give all data science consumers, the stakeholders, the person in charge of operations meant to be improved by the model, the person who the data scientist should be serving. I'm going to give you all permission. Next time a data scientist mentions RC curve or area under that curve, and when they say area under the curve, they mean area under the receiver operating characteristic. And next time you hear any of the above, you now have the right, I give you my blessing, to look at the data scientist in the eye and say, don't give me any of that. I want to know the business value. I want an estimation, a reasonable one. And all the RC curve is, all the area under the curve is doing is adding up across all the potential uses. As you mentioned, there's a sliver. Where do you draw the line? It might just be a sliver. You have a whole range of deployment options based on where you kind of draw that decision threshold. And I mean, we could speak to that a little more specifically. Eric, what was the model predicting in that example?
We were trying to predict which molecules we should test based on data that we had fed in so getting really into the weeds here, we use DNA encoded libraries, which creates billions of data points on how molecules interact with proteins. We were trying to predict molecules that were not in that original data set. And you're not going to buy
so which molecules are worth testing because they may interact effectively in order to fight a disease?
Yes,
exactly.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
I'm not in the life sciences, so when I hear stuff like that, I'm like, cool.
It was a very cool application, and we ended up publishing on it, and it was a really cool application. But one of the things I see is, I've literally had clients of mine when I was doing this through a company that I was heading up until a few months ago. They would say, but it didn't find everything we already knew. And I'm like, nobody said that this model was going to be perfect. And, I feel like
we don't have a magic crystal ball. Predicting better than guessing those potentially valuable. How do we turn the story you just said into an estimation of actual value? Well, if you actually do test a molecule you might not have otherwise tested, and it turns out to prove effective, put it in terms of a dollar amount or put it in terms of a number of human lives saved, some upside. And then every time you test a molecule that you probably on retrospect shouldn't have tested, how much money did you waste? Those are both factors. You put those factors and roll it up. It's just arithmetic. It's not the rocket science part. It's not the learning from data. It's not the machine learning part. It's the actual stress testing of that model, its intended usage, and estimating in terms of the metrics that matter to humanity or to the organization or whatever, right? Why don't we do that? It's kind of inertia. It's kind of a culture gap, but it's got to change, and it will change.
What I think is helpful when it comes to this kind of conversations is to drag your data scientists into the business discussions. So they hear about the gem and about the molecules, and they stop thinking exclusively about the area under the curve, but more so, what's my contribution to this molecule, this gem, this whatever, GLP-1 prediction or whatever it is we're modeling.
Right. And thanks for bringing that up. If everyone can look down what I've here, BizML, that's the name of the non-technical organizational process for running projects that are meant to do exactly what Elena just said. So I put in my dues here, trying to put a book out there and coin a new 5-letter buzzword to really try to bring that message out, not just to the data scientists, but to their customers.
Yeah, and I actually I'm really interested. I assume that we've been talking a lot about how the data scientists need to sort of tweak the way they talk, but do you, and I don't know, I am going to read your book now because now I'm super excited, but Eric has read your book, so it's almost like I did. What's the other direction? What do people who are business people need to change and do differently in order to be able to better understand and utilize the data science that's available to them?
My book, AI Playbook, that presents the BizML paradigm, the titular playbook, is for both sides, tech and biz, data science, the quant and the stakeholder. But probably if I had to pick one, it's first for the stakeholder, and the book ramps the reader up on the semi-technical understanding they need in order to collaborate deeply end-to-end across the project, from inception to actual deployment, and thereafter while you're monitoring and keep it going. The semi-technical understanding comes down to what's predicted, how well, and what's done about it. And it's not the rocket science part, but I know enough to use a car just about internal combustion in theory. I don't know where the spark plugs are, but I'm an expert at driving cars. I know momentum and friction, the rules of the road, and the mutual expectations of drivers, and how to operate the vehicle from the driver's seat. Likewise, analogously, stakeholders must know the same semi-technical understanding of machine learning projects in order to drive them successfully to deployment. So the book accomplishes the delivery of that BizML with lots of illustrative case studies from UPS, FICO, and some prominent .coms. And at the same time is ramping up the business side reader on that semi-technical understanding.
Great. Awesome. I'm definitely getting your book.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah. So Eric mentioned something about part of the reason he read the book. He admitted that was partly because we have almost exactly the same name. He just you guys spell your last name a little bit wrong, but other than that, Eric Siegel.
Well, that's because we've had the name spelling through Chat GPT, and it came out wrong. So.
Oh, okay. But I'm here to say that I think the book, and there's been a good number of press coverage and reviews and stuff. I think the book has been appreciated even by people who don't share my name.
I'm totally certain of that. Well, it's interesting because when I am a marketer, right? That's my background, and I ended up leading a data analytics function. And I actually think part of the reason it was there were two things. I think one is I knew what the business needed, so actually I was adding value as the leader of the group because I didn't know what they were.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's you're stealing one of my catchphrases, which is that these projects, more than anything, if you're not a data scientist, they need you once you've ramped up on that semi-technical understanding.
Well, and to that point, I mean, I listen to books all the time, and I probably crank through like 10 books in about 5 weeks, just trying to get this was a number of years ago.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Went through a number of books in about 5-6 weeks and just kept listening to books. I actually spent a whole bunch of time on data camp learning how, I don't code Python, but I learned enough about it so that I could understand when I looked at code or whatever. But I think, having a willingness as a non-data person to be like, what, this is not just mystical stuff. I just need to understand it. I mean, even just simple things like we had this company come in to try and do that forecast that I was talking about. And they were basically saying, we're going to charge you, I don't know, whatever it was, $150,000 to do 5 stores, and then if it works, we're going to multiply that by the number, up to the number of stores, and charge you whatever it was, $2 million, for the whole chain. And I'm like, I don't understand. That's not how machine learning works.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so just being able to, in the meantime, people that I worked with and worked for or whatever are like, oh, these guys are going to come in and they're going to do this thing. And I'm like, yeah, and we're about to pay them 10 times as much as they probably need to be paid. And not surprisingly, what the number one predictor of foot traffic is for this week is foot traffic last week,
So Eric and Jeff, you guys, I've sort of inferred that you guys are twins.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, we are.
So, and thankfully Eric has a beard, to help differentiate. But and Jeff has the glasses. So you guys worked this out really well. But also, am I to ascertain that Eric has more of the quant technical background? Yeah. So you two kind of represent those two sides, but clearly you're on the same page and you're able to communicate. Right.
Yes.
Do you find you kind of lean on each other for that? Do you find that this help? That you're kind of complementary.
This is what we call the twinning edge. That's a little plug for our company.
I see. All right. So that's why you've formed a company together. Of course.
Yeah, but I think it's right that combination of sort of the business, the people, the whatever understanding and the quant understanding, that you have to bring them both together. But yes, absolutely, that's kind of the way we think about it. So
we have one other host, by the way, that joins us, which is ChatGPT. Since we're talking AI, maybe Jeff, you can write some AI questions.
I didn't know I would have to share the stage with another guest.
So I always ask, before I ask our guests the questions from ChatGPT, I always ask for 10 funny questions for an expert in whatever. And then it always comes up with a mix of questions, and I will ask you 2 of them. And so I always ask guests, would you like absurd or thought-provoking first?
We should start with absurd.
Yeah. I would say, just as a general rule, people do. So
4 out of 5 podcast guests pick absurd when they're offered that question.
And do they recommend Trident to their patients?
They also recommend Trident gum to their patients.
I'm going to ask as my absurd question, because ChatGPT came up with this without knowing that just before we got on air, we were talking about lunch and so forth. And so the first question it literally asked was, if predictive analytics could predict your lunch choice, would it be right, or would you spike the algorithm and pick something random? That's your question.
Would I spike the algorithm? Is that what you
Spite.
Oh, you mean, so if it did predict correctly, would I therefore go
something else?
Yeah, no, I feel like that impulse would come up and be like, hey, it predicted the tuna sandwich, and that's what I was gonna eat. And then I feel like maybe I'm just doing something too obvious, or it's not just to spite the algorithm. It makes me think, if it's able to guess that, I must be doing the wrong thing, right?
This was reminding me of that scene in The Princess Bride where he goes on that long discussion of like which of the chalices are poisoned. Did you remember that? Did you see that movie? He's like,
did when it was in theater.
It was like, you would have poisoned the one that you put in front of you to trick me, but maybe you thought I would know that. Anyways.
Oh, right, that one. Yeah, the double, triple. Exactly. Yeah.
And then it turns out he poisoned both of them. So yeah.
That's right. Ha ha ha, and then he falls over.
I will say I'm having trouble finding one that's thought-provoking, so I guess I'm going to give you 2 absurd.
Right.
Have you ever built a model to predict how long it would take someone to understand predictive analytics?
No, but the whole sort of, so for education. So at my by the way, I think Eric, in the intro you called it Machine Learning Week magazine, but there's 2 different things. There's Machine Learning Week as the conference, and Machine Learning Times is the online publication, free monthly newsletter. So the conference, by the way, is June 2nd through 5th in Phoenix, and also I think next week in Munich. But And conference is kind of a combination between predictive and generative, about 50-50, which is unusual. Mostly it's just generative, like we're playing now with ChatGPT. But in terms of, it's sort of a question about a predictive application. And one of the keynotes that we had a long time ago was a guy who used predictive analytics to help him train to be, he ended up being one of the highest performing record breakers on the TV quiz show Jeopardy. And so he had it was predicting which questions he would get wrong during his training. So then, of course, it would serve him up the harder questions, harder for him. So there's a bunch of education examples like that. And I don't know if they've quite applied for educating about predictive analytics in particular, but it could.
Okay, I have to ask because I love the book Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson. Do you know that book?
No, I don't.
It was written in the mid 90s. And it was all about this like AI that was helping teach. Like it was like, you know, what we're doing now, but it was written 30 years
ago. Is this a nonfiction or is this a?
No, it's fiction. It's you know Neil Stephenson who wrote
right the Crasher, Snow Crasher.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Snow Crasher?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah, there's a book called.
I didn't read that either.
It's interesting because we were actually talking about this last week. Is like he predicted basically cryptocurrency in one book, and he predicted. Wow. You know, generative AI in another, and
but he was wrong about cryptocurrency because it exists, but it's not being used as a currency.
Yeah, well,
I think that's a different podcast, right?
I don't know that cryptocurrency. I still find mystifying, but it'll be fascinating to see where blockchain plays out as a technology and plays it. But
so if you guys don't mind, I'd like to kind of pivot back a little bit to the measuring of AI. And interestingly, Eric, I have this question. So AI is now eating Google's lunch, so to speak, aka taking over the search largely, right? And we had SEO to measure Google, and now we have GEO to measure AI. How do you actually compare? Can you really see what's lost on one side, what's gained on the other side, and how to go about using analytics for the new stuff vis-a-vis benchmarks that we already know?
So I haven't heard of GEO. Is that generative AI engine?
Yeah, that's like how you judge AI performance based on like contextual references and whatnot.
Okay, so I don't know. I don't know the numbers actually at this point to the degree to which people are relying on a chat bot or generative AI or language model output more than just standard search results. I don't really know the degree to which I personally am still, you know, I see at the top of my search results and I'm kind of like, I could just read that. And I see it in Amazon for product reviews. I'm like, I could just read this overview that it wrote. And I'm a little bit tempted because it looks like a nice, succinct summary, but I also know that it could have hallucinated, right? So I don't really know what the numbers are. They've got to be changing every week right now. Yeah. It's got to be fluctuating all over the place. People become disillusioned. There's this weird, you know, I think there's a real divisive polarizing between views on what everyone's calling AI. Often the word AI mostly refers to generative, and within that more language models than anything else. And there's this hype that tells the narrative that this has become human level, also known as artificial general intelligence. And I don't believe that we're actively headed there. And then there's a lot of naysayers who are just like, this is all just a joke. And it's just, you know, it's a randomized way to put words together. And they're far undercutting it. The hype far overcuts it, if that's a word. And I think that within that, just sort of like, well, for search, it's the same problem. It's kind of like a lot of people are going to be like, you should never trust it because you don't know what you don't know. Otherwise you wouldn't be searching. And then how do you know if it's just somehow hallucinated or, you know, given an
Well,
error and correct information.
especially compared to the websites, which are always telling the truth, right? No, I'm just kidding. So, like we also
No, but
don't.
there's certain level of reputation. There are websites that I feel very trusting of.
Yeah,
for
that's
a
fair.
variety of
That's
reasons.
fair. But there is, and Jeff and I have often talked about between ourselves this concept of the AI, the self-driving car problem the way we phrase it, which is if a self-driving car kills somebody. I think if you reread my article that I wrote about your book, I bring this up. Is like if it kills one person, AI is bad. It's terrible. It's never going to be worth anything. But meanwhile, hundreds of people are dying all the time, from getting hit by cars and where human beings are driving. And it's like almost this sort of expectation that it's, perfect or bust. And I really like and appreciate your whole concept of lift and sort of like the probability. You're trying to increase the probability of success, not necessarily just nail it every time. But my question for you, and we're sort of running out of time, but my question for you, last question for me is, where is AI working in your mind? Like some places it doesn't work that great yet, other places it's working, reasonably.
Well, I've been wanting to qualify one of my very early remarks, and thanks for reminding me, which I say most of these projects fail. I'm talking about enterprise ML, which is basically predictive AI. Difference between predictive and generative is not so much technical difference, but they're different categories of use cases. Right. Machine learning does nothing if not predict what word to write next, predict which customer is going to click, buy, lie, or die for these enterprise use cases. So they're just different kinds of use cases. Within predictive, where we need the BizML framework, where we have in lack of business metrics and so often a failure to launch, maybe 20% do launch. There's a lot of ways to look at those numbers, but it's something in that order. And I've conducted industry research, as have so many others. But a fraction of a lot of projects is a lot of successes. So I don't mean to say that it's not valuable or it's all gone to heck. I mean to say that the track record is sort of relatively dismal and stands to be improved, and very much can and should be improved. Right. But it's certainly extremely, it's been around for decades. Predictive use cases is older, but not old school. It's where most of its potential is largely untapped. And this is the technology, the type of use case that you turn to improve your existing large scale operations. Unlike generative, which is new kinds of capabilities, and they're really apples and oranges in terms of the value proposition. I'm very excited about, I've been excited forever. I've been in machine learning for 32 years and in an independent consultant for more than 20. So predictive, which is what most of us have been at, because generative really only emerged a couple of years ago. Very exciting, lots of use cases. That's the bread and butter of my conference and my books and such, and my consulting work. And now what we're doing with Gooder AI. On the generative side, I don't quite know how to answer the question, right? I think it's the most amazing thing I've ever seen in technology. It's extreme. It's sexy for good reason. I'm astonished by it. I never thought I'd see anything like it in my lifetime. That doesn't necessarily mean it's nearly as valuable as the promises that are often put out there by certain organizations and thought leaders. And how, in the degree to which is seemingly human-like as it is, that it's becoming human-like. So right now, most of the use cases are not end consumer facing. So it's sort of maybe a chat to do search and stuff internally at the organization about HR facts and stuff like that. Writing first drafts that will then subsequently always have the human in the loop and proofread it. Right. There's some really good returns there. They're not doubling efficiencies. They may be improving them by 30 or even up to 50%. But I think that it's changing rapidly, and what does it mean to be a killer app, right? I think that a lot of programmers would say that automatic coding is a killer app, and indeed increases, in that case, really can increase their productivity by multiple factors. But it's a very particular niche, and it's not what I think the world is waiting for in terms of killer app and the national and international stage, the promises of how valuable this stuff will be. A killer app that is your your new buddy, your personal assistant, right? And as an agent, rather than just a tool. That stuff is really questionable as far as the degree of plausibility. So I think that
I think it's most likely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
It's most likely to be useful in cases where probabilistic outcome, increasing the lift, the probabilistic outcome of good results is actually desirable, right? So, for example, tying it to, we've tied it in our marketing efforts to automation. And so we pick clips out of videos and we say, okay, is this one good enough to post? Well, there might be 5 of them and only one of them is good enough to post, but it took us 5 minutes to do all 5 of them. So it's kind of, I think it's when you tie it all together and then you start thinking differently, which honestly, I think may be the hardest part of is to get people to think probabilistically. That said, we are well over the half hour, and we like to go around, as I said in the intro before the show. We like to go around and have everybody say one thing. What I never tell the guests, but if you've seen our podcast before, I always make the guest go first, so you don't get any chance to think about what you're going to say. So, right. Eric, what's one thing you want to leave the podcast guest audience with?
Oh, it's absolutely critical to measure the potential value of machine learning models. The right metric, business metrics, savings or profit if you're a corporation, number of lives saved for healthcare, whatever it is. Don't let the data scientists tell you that they can't go further than area under the curve.
So, right. Thank you. And before I jump in with my one thing, Eric, what is the best place for people who want to contact you to reach you?
Well, right here is the URL for my book, BizML. That's the titular playbook of the book, bizml.com. And there's a bunch of pages about me and my work there, links to the conference Machine Learning Week. I'm also easy to find on LinkedIn if you spell my last name correctly, unlike a couple other people in the Brady Bunch window here.
Well, this has been a terrific conversation. I always find it fascinating, this point, which is that it's really a two-way street. You need both the data scientists to understand the business, or you're not going to get anything useful. But you also need the business people to understand what is. They don't have to understand the nuts and bolts, but they have to understand what is possible about data. With the data science, so that they know to ask the right questions and use the technology in the right way. And I will also say I am definitely, your book is now going to be next on my list. So
awesome. So you need both the Eric and the Jeff.
Yes, exactly. You need an Eric and a Jeff. So, anyway, I'll pass it over to Elena.
And an Eric and an Elena to make it all right.
Absolutely. So I actually will be along the same lines and say that it's essential to measure the effectiveness of the models, and it's actually essential to use the models to be fit to purpose to measure business effectiveness. So don't construct the models because they're fun to construct, but construct them with the end goal in mind of what we're trying to accomplish, optimize, improve, predict, etc.
Absolutely.
Cool. So my one thing is, well, I'm going to say 2 things, but first of all, I'm just obsessed by this concept of lift and probabilistic, but I've already talked about that. But what I want to say is, I really think it was interesting, and I think it's reflected in your book, that BizML, the way that you describe it, that piece about the rocket science part, right? The algorithm writing or whatever is obviously a core central piece, but it's a very small piece of what you're proposing is the right thing to do. And I think that's, as I said, I think it's really important to realize that this is not, the goal isn't the AI itself or the ML itself. The goal is what is it going to do and how is it going to have positive impact.
Right. We shouldn't be more excited about the rocket science than the launch of the rocket.
Exactly. And that's kind of where we've been for the last couple of years. But I think it's tipping. Anyway, thank you so much, Eric Siegel. It was great to meet you and see how much difference that other E makes in your name and so forth. So, great having you. And
the other E. Sorry.
The other E.
Yeah. It was great to be on the pod. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elena.